The wheelchair hit the floor first. Then Emily Carter hit it a second later, her shoulder cracking against the polished terminal tile, while a Louis Vuitton bag landed in the space she'd just occupied. The bodyguard hadn't even looked at her when he shoved, just an obstacle between his employer and the gate. Around her, maybe 60 people stood frozen, watching. A few pulled out phones. Nobody moved. The billionaire stepped over her rolling water bottle without breaking stride, his voice carrying across the terminal like he owned it, because in every room he'd ever entered, he essentially did. "Move her out of the way," he said. Not to anyone specific, just to the air, to the universe, to whoever was lowest. They thought she was nobody. They were wrong about that. If this story already has your attention, stay with me until the very end. Follow my channel, hit like, and drop a comment below, telling me the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that airport terminal and find out exactly who Emily Carter really was. The morning had started badly before it got worse. Emily had been awake since 4:30, which was nothing new. Old habit. In the years she'd spent rotating through forward operating bases across 3 different continents, the body learned to surface before the alarm. Alert, scanning, cataloging. She didn't miss much about those years, but she'd kept that part of herself without trying. You don't shed the things that kept you alive. She'd taken the wheelchair 2 weeks ago after a routine surgery on her left knee, a torn meniscus that had finally demanded attention after years of her ignoring it. The orthopedic surgeon had told her 8 weeks minimum before she could bear full weight. Emily had negotiated him down to 6 by producing a list of activities she intended to resume, and he'd looked at that list with the expression of a man who understood he was not going to win this argument. Ridgehaven Medical Center had given her temporary leave. She'd used the first week to catch up on sleep. The second week, she'd started reviewing clinical journals and answering emails from her nursing unit about protocol questions, because the leave was temporary, but her brain didn't know how to stop running. The Ridgehaven City Airport, formerly called Ridgehaven Carver International, though nobody under 60 called it that, was crowded for a Tuesday. A late summer weather system had pushed a series of cancellations through the weekend, and now passengers were stacked up across every terminal like sediment. Emily had arrived 90 minutes early, specifically to avoid this. She'd navigated the rideshare drop-off zone in the wheelchair her hospital had provided, managed the check-in line with less difficulty than she'd expected, and had found a relatively clear corridor near Gate 17 where she could wait without anyone's rolling luggage clipping her wheels every 3 minutes. She had a connecting flight to Mercer City, where her sister lived. 4 days off, her sister's small backyard, her sister's loud kids, her sister's insistence on cooking things from scratch, even when everyone, including herself, would have preferred delivery. Emily had been looking forward to it with the particular intensity of someone who didn't take time off enough. She'd been rolling slowly through the corridor between Gate 17 and Gate 19 when the Langford party arrived. You knew they were coming before you saw them. 3 advanced men in dark jackets entered first, scanning faces and exits with the practiced efficiency of people whose job was to make a bubble of space appear in any crowd they entered. Behind them came the luggage, actual luggage, multiple rolling cases that 2 of the advanced men were steering through the terminal without any apparent concern for the humans they required to detour around. And then the family. Dalton Langford was 63 years old and had the posture of a man who had never once in his adult life waited in a line without someone eventually apologizing to him for the inconvenience. He was tall, well-maintained in the way of men who have personal trainers and regular skin treatments, with silver hair and a jaw that photographers had always loved. His real estate development company, Langford Group, had 17 projects active in Ridgehaven alone. His face was on a billboard near the airport exit. Emily had driven past it that morning without registering it as anything other than background. Behind him walked his son Garrett, 26, who had the look of someone who had been told he was exceptional often enough that it had calcified into belief. Garrett's girlfriend walked beside him. Dark hair, expensive luggage, the practiced vacancy of someone who'd learned to disappear in crowds her boyfriend created. And behind them, the bodyguard. Marcus Briggs stood 6'3" and had the kind of physical presence that made rooms reorganize themselves. He had served as Dalton Langford's personal security chief for 4 years. He knew exactly how to use his size, and he used it constantly. He hadn't seen Emily because he hadn't been looking for anyone at her eye level. She'd been angled slightly left, checking her phone for a gate change notification, when the advance luggage cut into the corridor. She'd started to roll right to give it room. Briggs had been cutting left at the same moment, corralling the luggage line away from a cluster of business travelers near the gate entrance, and he turned without looking. His forearm caught the back of the wheelchair with full weight behind it. The chair went sideways. Emily went with it, 1 second upright, the next second on the floor, her left knee landing wrong, a bloom of pain that spiked bright and immediate. Her carry-on bag spilled. Her phone skittered across the tile and stopped against someone's shoe. She lay still for a moment, face close to the cool floor, cataloging. Knee was bad, but nothing new had torn. Shoulder impact, but she could move it. Palm scraped. Not catastrophic. She'd had worse. Much, much worse. She started pushing herself up. "Move her out of the way," Dalton Langford's voice, directed at no one. The air. She was the obstacle, not the person. Briggs reached down, not to help her up, but to push the toppled wheelchair aside so the luggage line could continue moving. He didn't touch her. He didn't look at her. He cleared the path around her the way you'd move a cone out of a parking lane. Emily got herself upright on her hands first, then one knee, her jaw tight against the pain. Around her, silence. 60-something people in eyeshot of the incident and the ambient noise of the terminal continued uninterrupted. The gate announcements, the distant rumble of rolling luggage, the white noise of a place where people were always passing through and never staying. 3 people had their phones raised. No one had moved toward her. A woman in a red coat started forward. Emily caught the motion, the half-step of someone deciding, and then stopped when one of the advance men placed himself gently between the woman and the corridor without technically blocking her, just making the movement feel complicated. She stopped, looked away. Emily got herself off the floor. It took longer than she wanted, and it hurt more than she showed. She found the wheelchair upright on its wheels against the gate desk, and she got back into it without assistance. Her water bottle had rolled into the foot traffic lane. She didn't retrieve it. "You need to get security over here," said a man nearby. 30s, travel clothes, speaking to no one in particular. He said it with the mild authority of someone registering a complaint to the universe rather than actually doing anything. Nobody called security. Emily collected her spilled carry-on, checked that her phone wasn't cracked, it wasn't, and sat in the wheelchair with her hands folded on her bag in her lap. Her knee was throbbing. Her palm had a long red scrape along the heel that wasn't quite bleeding. She breathed once, slow, and looked at Dalton Langford's back as he moved toward the gate entrance. She didn't say anything. There would have been a time, years ago, when she might have. A younger version of herself, hotter, louder, less patient, might have put her voice into that corridor and made it carry. But she'd learned a long time ago that anger spent immediately was anger that couldn't be used later. She'd learned it in places a lot more consequential than this airport. So she sat, and she watched, and she remembered everything. The security officer who finally appeared was a woman named Priya Desmond, badge number 441, who had the look of someone 5 years past caring about interpersonal disputes in the terminal, but still professional enough to clock the scene for what it was. "Someone called this in," Priya said, without quite asking a question. "She was obstructing the corridor," said one of the advance men, whose name Emily didn't know yet, "blocking the path to the gate." "That's not accurate," Emily said. "She rolled into Mr. Langford's party while they were in transit." "That's also not accurate." Priya looked between them with the eyes of a woman who had heard every variation of this conversation and had her own read already. She looked at Emily's wheelchair. She looked at the scrape on Emily's palm. She looked at the advance man with the careful blankness of a professional who was calculating exactly how much of this was going to become her problem. "What happened to your hand?" Priya asked Emily. "I was knocked from the chair and fell." "She lost her balance," the advance man said. "In what sense does a person lose their balance while seated in a wheelchair?" Emily asked, conversationally. No edge in it. The advance man's jaw moved. Briggs had appeared at the fringe of the gathering now, his arms loosely crossed, watching. He had the specific stillness of a large man who has learned that stillness is more intimidating than movement in most situations. "I didn't touch her," Briggs said. "Not defensive, flat." "No," Emily said. "Your forearm did. Left side, rear of the chair. Approximately 38 pounds of lateral force. I was watching the gate monitor and had no warning contact was coming. She looked at Priya. There are cameras in this section, 4 of them that I can see from where I'm sitting. Whatever they captured will show the sequence clearly. Briggs's stillness developed a small fracture. Something shifted in his eyes. Recalculation. She'd cited the cameras specifically, and she'd said it like someone who already knew what the footage contained, not like someone hoping it might help. Priya made a note. Do you want to file a formal incident report? Before Emily could answer, Dalton Langford turned around. She'd thought he was ignoring the entire exchange, had assumed he had decided the situation beneath active attention. But he had apparently been listening. He came back 3 steps into the conversation with the comfortable authority of a man who had been treated as the most important person in every room for 4 decades. Officer, he said to Priya, not unkindly, just from altitude, this woman rolled into my security personnel in a crowded corridor. These things happen in airports. Marcus was trying to prevent an incident, not cause one. He smiled, practiced but genuine enough. The smile of a man who had charmed his way through thousands of exactly these moments. If she was hurt, we're sorry about that, but I think we can all agree this doesn't require a report. Priya said nothing. We have a flight in 40 minutes, Langford continued, and I'd like my family to reach the gate without further disruption. Emily watched him. He didn't look at her while he spoke. She remained background. That was probably the calculation. The easiest way to manage an obstacle was to address the person with authority over it and not engage the obstacle directly. Sir, Priya said carefully, the individual in the wheelchair has the right to— I'm sure she does. Langford's smile didn't waver. I'm not disputing her rights. I'm asking whether we might handle this with some common sense instead of making it complicated. Making it complicated. That phrase, the quiet threat inside it, the suggestion that pursuing a legitimate complaint would be an act of unreasonableness. Emily had heard it before in different forms. In every institution, in every chain of command, in every environment where someone with status had decided that the path of least resistance for everyone ran through the door they wanted to open. She'd watched it work on people 100 times. Priya's pen had stopped moving. Emily said, I'll make it easy. I don't need a report right now. She looked at Priya directly. But I'd appreciate it if you noted the time and location of the incident for the camera record, badge 441, in case something changes. Priya looked at her for a moment. Something in the look, brief, almost invisible, acknowledged the thing Emily had just done. The documentation, the specificity, the way someone who understood process laid a foundation before they were told they needed one. I'll note it, Priya said. Langford nodded graciously and turned back toward his gate. Briggs followed. The advance men fell into position around the luggage. Garrett Langford, who'd been watching the whole thing from 20 feet away with the slightly bored attention of someone watching a mildly interesting street performance, touched his girlfriend's elbow and followed his father. The crowd dispersed. Emily sat in the wheelchair and breathed. Her knee was still throbbing. Her palms stung. She had a flight in 47 minutes. She thought about her sister's backyard and the loud kids and the food cooked from scratch. She thought about the 4 days she'd been looking forward to for 2 weeks. She thought about how she was not going to let this corridor, this man, this morning, dissolve something she'd actually been anticipating. She rolled toward the water fountain to rinse her palm. But the collapse happened 14 minutes later. She heard the sounds before she processed them. A commotion near Gate 18, the specific pitch of crowd noise when it transitions from ambient to alarmed. Not shouts, not screaming, but that sudden contraction of sound, the way a room inhales. She was near the end of the corridor, had already started her approach to Gate 17's boarding queue, and she turned without thinking. The crowd at Gate 18 had formed the familiar ring, the instinctive human circle around an emergency that simultaneously wants to help and can't stop watching. Through the gap in the ring, Emily could see someone on the floor. She moved the wheelchair forward. The crowd was dense enough that she had to speak. Excuse me, please move to the left." People moved. She got through. Garrett Langford was on the ground. He'd gone down hard. She could tell from the way his body was positioned, no protective instincts, no catch, just a collapse. He was conscious, but barely. His eyes were half open and tracking wrong, his breath coming in shallow, rapid intervals. His color wrong in the way that color went wrong when the body was shutting non-essential systems down. His girlfriend was kneeling beside him, both hands on his face, saying his name in escalating repetitions that weren't reaching him. An advanced man was on the phone. 2 gate agents had emerged from behind the desk and were standing uselessly close. Dalton Langford stood at the edge of the ring with the first expression Emily had seen on his face that wasn't controlled. He looked afraid. He looked for the first time in the 25 minutes she'd observed him, like a person. Emily rolled to the edge of the ring and stopped. She looked at Garrett, the pallor, the breathing, the eyes, the specific quality of absence starting to move through him. "What happened?" she said. He just fell," the girlfriend said without looking up. "Did he complain of anything before he fell? Chest pain, headache, arm numbness?" "He said he felt dizzy. He said," her voice fractured, "he said his chest felt tight." Emily looked at the advanced man on the phone. "Is that 911? "Yes." "Tell them possible cardiac event. Patient is mid-20s, conscious but altered, shallow respirations, approximately 60 to 90 seconds down. Tell them we need AED if the terminal has one." The advanced man looked at her. The wheelchair, the hospital ID clipped to her bag strap that she'd forgotten to remove when she left the medical center. He repeated what she'd said into the phone. Emily was already moving out of the chair. It wasn't graceful. Her knee protested immediately, loudly, with the specific fury of a joint that had been told to rest and was now being ignored. She got down to the floor beside Garrett in a controlled descent, left leg compensating weight on her right side, and was at his shoulder before anyone had processed that she'd moved. "Give me space. Now." She said it without volume, but the 2 gate agents stepped back immediately, and the girlfriend shifted left without being asked twice. The voice had something in it that most people couldn't name, but all people recognized. She put 2 fingers to Garrett's neck. Pulse. Present, irregular, too fast, and too weak. She leaned close to his airway. Breathing, present, insufficient. She checked his pupils, one responding slower than the other, which was wrong in a way that sharpened her attention. "Garrett," she said, close to his ear, "I'm going to help you. I need you to try to stay with me. Can you squeeze my hand?" A faint pressure. "Yes." "Good." She looked up. "I need whoever has the AED to bring it here now, not when they're ready, now. And I need that circle to open up. Give him air. Stand back, everyone who isn't helping." The ring widened. "Does anyone know if he has any cardiac history, any medications, any prior episodes?" "He had a heart thing," Dalton Langford said. His voice was different. The altitude was gone from it. "When he was 17, he had a..." He looked at the advanced man. "What did they call it?" "SVT," said the advanced man. "Supraventricular tachycardia. He had an ablation." Emily nodded. Made sense. The irregular pulse, the rapid shallow breathing, the sudden collapse without warning. She looked at the girlfriend. "Any medications currently?" He has a prescription, metoprolol, I think." "Did he take it today?" I don't know. He might not have. We left so early." Emily moved her hands to Garrett's sternum, reading him through pressure, positioning him more carefully. The procedure was a vagal maneuver, a specific physical intervention designed to interrupt an arrhythmia. Standard training, something she'd done in conditions considerably more difficult than a clean airport floor with adequate light. She'd done it in the back of a vehicle, moving at 60 miles an hour over unpaved road. She'd done it in a building where 3 of the 4 walls had been partially compromised. She'd done it on someone who didn't speak any language she'd ever learned. This was the easiest version she'd ever done. She talked Garrett through it, low and steady, while she worked. His pulse began to correct in the second minute. She felt it shift under her fingers, the rhythm pulling itself back from the edge of crisis into something that would hold. His color improved incrementally. His eyes came into better focus. By the time the paramedics arrived 4 minutes and 20 seconds later, she counted, it was a habit. Garrett Langford was conscious, oriented, and breathing adequately. His pulse was irregular but manageable. He was going to be transferred and monitored, and he was going to be fine. The paramedics had brought a gurney. Emily talked them through the current status with the specific efficiency of someone who had handed patients off in 100 different circumstances. and understood what information mattered and in what order. Vitals, history summary, intervention taken, response time, current status. The lead paramedic, a woman with a silver-streaked braid and the practiced briskness of 15 years on the job, listened without interrupting and gave Emily one quick look of professional acknowledgement when she finished. "Good catch," she said. Medic to medic. "He's got history," Emily said. "Make sure cardiology has the ablation records before they do anything." "Copy." Emily moved back to let them work. She found her wheelchair and got back into it with considerably more difficulty than she'd left it. Her knee was not letting the last 12 minutes go unaddressed. She gripped the armrest until the worst of it faded. The crowd had grown. Gates up and down the corridor had emptied slightly as passengers drifted toward the commotion. 2 news cameras had appeared from somewhere, airport staff probably, or travelers who'd started recording. Emily was in the center of the sightline for at least 4 phone cameras. She was aware of this and it registered as mildly irrelevant. What she noticed instead was the thing at the edge of the crowd. 3 military officers, dress uniforms. Ridgehaven Carver was not an unusual airport for military presence. There was a National Guard base 40 miles north, and the airport was a regular transit point. But these 3 weren't in transit posture. They'd come through the gate 16 corridor and stopped, and they were looking at her with an expression that didn't fit the context of the moment. Not watching an emergency, not watching a stranger, watching her. The senior of the 3, a colonel, she read it without thinking, the insignia, a language she still spoke fluently, said something to the man beside him. Emily couldn't hear it, but she watched his face and she recognized the look. She'd seen it before, from other people in other rooms. The specific adjustment that happened in someone's expression when they encountered someone outside their expected context and had to recalibrate everything. He took 3 steps forward, through the edge of the crowd, and stopped in front of her. "Carter," he said. Not a question, not a greeting exactly, more like confirmation. She looked at him, recognized his face in the way you recognized something you'd filed away under a different category, a different time. "Colonel Marsh," she said. He looked at what had just happened, the gurney being wheeled toward the corridor, the paramedics, the crowd, and then he looked back at her, and something moved through his expression that she didn't have a clean name for. "You on the job?" he asked. "I'm on leave," she said. "Knee surgery." He looked at her knee, looked at the wheelchair, looked at the scrape on her palm. "What happened to your hand?" "Airport," she said. He held her gaze for a second. Then he nodded, slowly, the way people nodded when they understood something without needing it explained. Across the terminal, she could see Dalton Langford. He was watching her from beside the gate desk, his composure mostly restored, his arms folded. But there was something new in his face. Not gratitude, not exactly. Something more complicated. Something that looked like a man who had made a calculation and was now realizing the calculation might need to be revised. She didn't know yet what he'd decide. She didn't know that the security footage on 4 cameras had captured everything. The shove, the fall, the bodyguard's arm, the crowd's silence, and the moment she'd gotten herself off the floor without a word. She didn't know that Priya Desmond, badge 441, had flagged the incident on the internal log with the timestamp and location Emily had requested, and that the flag had been noticed by a supervisor who'd reviewed the corridor footage before the paramedics had even arrived. She didn't know that Colonel Marsh had already taken out his phone and was doing something with it that was not unrelated to her. What she knew was that her flight was in 22 minutes, and her knee was screaming, and her sister was going to call in 2 hours to ask if she'd landed yet. She put her hands on the wheels of the chair and started moving toward gate 17. Behind her, she heard Dalton Langford tell one of his advance men to find out who that woman was. And she heard, clearly, distinctly, Briggs say, "Just a nurse. Don't worry about it." She didn't stop, didn't turn around, didn't change pace, but her hands tightened on the wheels, and somewhere behind her sternum, something went very, very still. The gate agent called Group 2 boarding, and Emily kept her hands moving on the wheels and didn't look back. Her phone buzzed in her bag. She ignored it. Then it buzzed again and again. 3 rapid pulses that meant someone was calling, not texting. And she pulled it out and looked at the screen expecting her sister. The number wasn't one she had saved. Ridgehaven area code, but that was all she could read into it. She let it go to voicemail. The boarding line had thinned. She got into it near the end, behind a family with 2 car seats and approximately 15 pounds of snacks distributed across every member. And she stood in line in the functional sense, hands on the wheels, weight off the knee, watching the corridor behind her the way she always watched corridors. Old habit. She wasn't worried, exactly, but she was paying attention. Dalton Langford's party had disappeared through gate 18. Same airline, different flight. She'd caught the destination board earlier. They weren't on her plane, small mercies. The gate agent scanned her boarding pass and looked at the wheelchair. "Do you need assistance boarding?" "I'll manage," Emily said, "but I'll need the chair checked at the jetway." "Of course." The woman was professional, kind without being condescending. Emily nodded once in something that wasn't quite a thank you, but was pointed in that direction. She made it down the jetway and onto the plane and into her seat and got her bag in the overhead bin in a single uninterrupted sequence that cost her more than she'd admit. Then she sat and put her earbuds in and closed her eyes and gave her knee 45 seconds of uninterrupted attention, which was all she had to spare. Her phone buzzed again before they hit the runway. Same unknown number. Then a text from that number, just 4 words. "This is Aaron Marsh." She stared at it. Then, below it, "Don't go anywhere yet." The plane was already taxiing. Mercer City was overcast when she landed, the sky the specific gray of early autumn that looked like rain deciding whether to commit. Her sister Nora was waiting at arrivals, standing slightly too far forward past the barrier, the way Nora always stood, impatient in the specific way of a person who knew they were early and couldn't stop watching for you anyway. "You look terrible," Nora said, and hugged her immediately and hard, which was also exactly Nora. "Knee," Emily said into her sister's shoulder. I know, car's close. I got the pickup spot. Come on." Nora was already in motion, taking the carry-on without asking and maneuvering through the arrivals crowd with the efficiency of a woman who had 2 small children and hadn't moved slowly through any public space in 4 years. They got to the car. Emily transferred out of the travel chair and into the passenger seat and exhaled for the first time since the terminal floor. Nora put the chair in the trunk and got behind the wheel and pulled into the departures loop before she said anything else. "What actually happened?" Nora said. "To the knee?" "To your hand." Emily looked at her palm. The scrape had dried and reddened into a clean stripe across the heel of her hand. She hadn't done anything about it. "Airport," she said. Nora's driving didn't change, but something in her jaw did. Airport meaning what? Incident in the terminal. "Someone's bodyguard knocked my chair." "Knocked your—" Nora stopped, started again. "Emily?" "I'm fine." "You said that from the hospital when you had a through and through in your shoulder, so I'm going to need something more specific." Emily almost smiled. "I'm not shot. Fell from the chair, scraped my palm, aggravated the knee. Nothing structural." She paused. "There was also a medical emergency afterward. One of the family's sons went into arrhythmia. I assisted." Nora was quiet for a moment, processing the sequence. "So the people whose bodyguard knocked you over, you saved their kid." "I assisted the patient. He would have been fine eventually." "Probably isn't eventually." "No," Emily said. "It's not." Nora merged onto the highway and didn't say anything for a mile and a half. This was one of the things Emily had always valued about her sister. The ability to sit inside information without needing to immediately reshape it into something more manageable. "Are you going to do something about the bodyguard thing?" Nora asked. "I documented it." "That's not the same as doing something." "I know what it is." Her phone was in her pocket. Aaron Marsh's texts were still sitting there unanswered. She hadn't responded before the flight, and she hadn't responded in the air, and she still didn't know exactly what to do with the fact that a colonel she'd served under in a context she didn't typically discuss had sent her 2 messages in an airport and told her not to go anywhere. She'd go anywhere she wanted. She always had. But she was thinking about it. Well, Nora's house was a narrow 2-story in a neighborhood that had been working class 30 years ago and was now contested territory between renovation budgets and original residents who'd outlasted 3 waves of real estate interest. The yard was small and deliberately overgrown in the back. Nora had decided 4 years ago to stop fighting what the garden wanted to do and start letting it do it. The result was somewhat chaotic and somehow peaceful. Her kids, Tomas, 7, and Lily, 4, attacked Emily the moment she came through the door with the particular ferocity of children for whom a beloved aunt who didn't visit enough represented a significant deficit that required immediate correction. Tomas wanted to know how the wheelchair worked. Lily sat in Emily's lap and regarded her with the solemn, absolute focus of a 4-year-old who had decided Emily was hers. Emily spent the evening not thinking about the airport, which took effort, which she was practiced at. She went to bed at 9, slept in broken intervals the way she always did in unfamiliar spaces. At 2:47 in the morning, she was fully awake, staring at the ceiling of Nora's spare room, and she picked up her phone and opened Aaron Marsh's message and typed, "What's going on?" The response came in 6 minutes, which meant he'd also been awake. "The family is making noise. The airport is in a bad position. I'd like to talk before this moves somewhere you don't want it to move." She typed, "What family?" "Langford." She'd expected it, and it still landed wrong. She put the phone face down on the nightstand and stared at the ceiling again for a while. Then she picked it up. "Talk when?" "Tomorrow works. Your call on time." She set a time and put the phone down and didn't sleep again until almost 5. She called Marsh from Nora's back garden at 9 the next morning, while Lily reorganized a box of sidewalk chalk by some system only comprehensible to 4-year-olds, and Tomas ran a complex autonomous operation involving a toy excavator and what appeared to be a criminal trial. Marsh answered on the first ring. "I'll be direct," he said, which was his way. She'd always appreciated that about him. "Please." Langford's team contacted airport administration last night. They're framing the incident as an altercation initiated by you. They have a statement from the bodyguard saying you came into contact with his arm voluntarily, reaching for something, and that the fall was the result of your own instability in the chair. Emily looked at a weed growing from the joint between 2 patio stones. "That's specific." "They have a witness. Someone who was in the corridor. He signed a statement." "Who is he?" "We don't know yet. Airport security is reviewing it." A pause. "The airport is in a complicated position here, Emily. Langford Group has 2 development projects adjacent to the city's infrastructure that are in contract with the county. The airport director and at least 2 board members have Langford-adjacent business relationships. This isn't something I'm speculating about. It's documented. So they're going to bury it. They haven't yet. But the pressure is real, and it's coming from above the security supervisor level." She was quiet for a moment. The excavator operation had expanded into the corner of the yard. Lily had aligned the sidewalk chalk into a very particular order. "What do you want from me, Aaron?" "Nothing you don't want to give, but I want you to know what's moving before it gets to you sideways." Another pause. "I'm not calling you as a private citizen. I made some calls this morning." "What kind of calls?" "The kind that remind certain people of what's on record." She understood what he meant and didn't pursue it. Aaron Marsh was not a man who used implication carelessly. "Is this going to become something formal?" "That depends on what Langford decides to make it." "And if he decides to make it a lot?" "Then we'll respond accordingly." His voice was even, not aggressive, just certain in the specific way of someone who had operated in environments where uncertainty was a tactical liability and had simply removed it from his available responses. "You didn't do anything wrong at that airport. You never have, in any context I'm aware of. I'd like the record to reflect that." Emily looked at the garden. Nora's cultivated chaos, the blackberry cane crawling up the back fence, the self-seeded tomatoes that had come up in a crack between 2 raised beds, the herbs that had long since escaped their designated corner, something in it that had been let go and found its own shape. "Keep me updated," she said. "Will do." She hung up and sat in the garden for a while, holding the phone. Tomas appeared at her elbow. "Who was that?" "Someone from work." "Your nurse work or your other work?" She looked at him. He said it with the total casual certainty of a 7-year-old asking about the weather. Her nurse work or her other work. And she understood that Nora had apparently said more to her children than Emily had realized. "What do you know about my other work?" she asked. He shrugged with his whole body, the boneless shrug of a child. "Mom says you helped soldiers. She says you're very brave and also sometimes you do dumb things that scare her." He considered this. "Both," she says. Emily sat with that for a moment. Both is accurate, she said. The call from the airport came at noon. Not Priya Desmond. Not the security supervisor she'd spoken to in passing after the incident. A name she didn't recognize, Arthur Greel, Deputy Director of Terminal Operations. The call was cordial. Professionally, almost aggressively cordial, in the way that cordial became a signal rather than a tone. Ms. Carter, I'm reaching out to follow up on the incident report from yesterday's occurrence at Gate 17. I didn't file an incident report, she said. I asked the security officer to note the incident on the camera log. That's different. A beat of silence. Yes. Well, the note was flagged as part of our standard review process, and I wanted to personally follow up and ensure that, did someone ask you to call me? Another beat. Shorter this time, but she caught it. I'm calling as part of standard protocol for any, Mr. Greel, I appreciate the call. I'd appreciate it more if you told me directly what you're following up about. He shifted tactics. Smoother, but not smooth enough. We've received a formal account of the incident from another party. In the interest of being thorough, we wanted to gather your perspective before what? Before any formal determination is made. She turned it over. Formal determination. That was language for something that had already been decided and needed a procedural wrapper. What's the other party's account? She asked. I'm not in a position to share that at this stage. But you're asking for my account. Correct. So you want me to respond to something I can't see? He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. I'll put my account in writing, she said. Email. Please send me the relevant contact address, and I'll have it to you by end of day. That's not quite the standard. I'd prefer to have the exchange documented, given the circumstances. She kept her voice even, practical. The same voice she used in clinical settings when she needed someone to understand that she was not negotiating the thing they thought she was negotiating. I'm happy to cooperate fully with any review, in writing, with documentation. Would you prefer I also include the security camera request from yesterday? The third silence was the longest. Email will be fine, he said. She wrote the email that afternoon. 3 paragraphs. Factual. No editorializing. Time-stamped references to the camera locations she'd noted in real time and the badge number of the security officer who'd been present. She attached a photo of her scraped palm that she'd taken on the flight. The habit of documentation ran deep. She sent it to Greel, CC'd the general inbox for terminal security, and then forwarded the full thread to Aaron Marsh with a single line. For your awareness. Marsh responded 20 minutes later. Good. Don't respond to anything else without telling me first. She typed back, I'll make my own calls on that. A longer pause than usual. Then, fair. But let me know. She was in the middle of helping Tomas with a homework project about ecosystems when her phone lit up again with a number she didn't recognize. Not a Ridgehaven area code this time. She let it go. Then a text from the same number. Ms. Carter, my name is Vivian Tran. I'm a journalist with the Ridgehaven Courier. I'd like to talk about what happened at the airport yesterday. I have the footage. Emily set the phone face down. Aunt M, Tomas said, you have to help me with the food chain part. Right. She pulled his worksheet toward her. Who eats what? Yeah. Okay, start with what's at the bottom. He started explaining the ecosystem he'd chosen. A wetland, apparently. His teacher had assigned it randomly, and he had not been enthused. And Emily listened and helped him think through the chain without doing it for him, which was harder than it sounded. And in the back of her mind, she was thinking about Vivian Tran, who had footage, and about Arthur Greel, who had called with cordial aggression, and about Aaron Marsh, who had made calls to remind certain people of what was on record, and about Marcus Briggs saying just a nurse with the specific confidence of a man who had never been wrong about that kind of assessment and didn't think he was going to start now. Just a nurse. As if that was a diminishment. As if that was the smallest thing she'd ever been. She helped Tomas finish the food chain. She ate dinner with Nora and the kids. She put Lily to bed at Nora's request because Lily had decided Emily was doing it and Nora had decided not to fight that battle. She sat in the narrow chair beside Lily's bed and told a story that she mostly made up as she went, about a girl who found a garden that grew things nobody had names for, and Lily was asleep before the ending. She texted Vivian Tran from the hallway. What footage? The response was immediate and included an attachment. Emily opened it. The angle was from the Gate 17 camera. The one she'd estimated was covering the corridor from roughly 40 feet east. The resolution was standard airport security quality, which meant it was grainy at the edges but perfectly clear in the center frame. It showed the Langford party moving through the corridor. It showed the luggage. It showed her in the wheelchair slightly left of center, looking at her phone. And it showed Briggs's arm, unmistakably, in the particular geometry that couldn't be misread as anything accidental, swinging back and connecting with the rear of the chair with force and intention. Not a brush, not a corridor mishap. A sweep. The footage ran 12 seconds. The second half showed the chair going sideways and Emily going with it, and the luggage continuing past and the Langford party not stopping. Her jaw was tight. She typed, "Where did you get this?" Vivian Tran. "I have a source inside the airport security review. They're worried about what's being done to this footage." Emily. "What's being done to it?" Vivian Tran. "That's what I need to talk to you about." Emily stood in the hallway outside Lily's room, in the narrow dark, the glow of her phone the only light. She looked at the 12 seconds of footage again. She looked at the clarity of Briggs's arm. She thought about Arthur Greal and formal determination and the question of what you did to footage when the footage showed something the wrong people didn't want shown. Then she called Aaron Marsh. He answered in 2 rings. She didn't give him a preamble. "The airport is moving to suppress the security footage," she said. A silence, shorter than she expected. "How do you know that?" "A journalist contacted me. She has a copy. Says a source inside the review flagged it before it could be altered or buried. The original footage is clear, Aaron, crystal clear." She heard him breathe out, slow, measured, the sound of a calculation being revised. "Okay," he said. "Listen to me." "I'm listening." "Don't talk to the journalist yet, not yet. Give me 6 hours." "For what?" "There's a federal component to tampering with airport security records. I want to make a call before this goes public and we lose the ability to control how it comes out." She leaned against the wall. The house was quiet, except for the specific quality of quiet that houses with sleeping children had. Not empty, just temporarily still. 6 hours, she said. 6 hours. She ended the call and stood in the dark hallway for a long moment. Down the hall, through Nora's closed door, she could hear the low sound of the television. Tomas was almost certainly still awake in his room despite the stated bedtime, running some private mental operation she'd probably never have access to. She typed to Vivian Tran, "I'm not ready to talk yet, but don't publish anything until I contact you, please." The reply took 4 minutes. "I'll hold for 24 hours. After that it moves." Emily put her phone in her pocket and went back down the hallway toward the stairs and stopped at the top of them, her hand on the railing, looking at the dark of the landing below. 24 hours. Somewhere in Ridgehaven, the security footage existed in some form, original, copied, or altered, and Dalton Langford's legal team was almost certainly already in conversation with airport administration, and Marcus Briggs was almost certainly already being told what version of events to commit to. She knew how this moved. She'd seen institutions close ranks before, seen the machinery of self-protection activate in organizations far more disciplined and better resourced than an airport terminal board. She knew how evidence got managed and how accounts got aligned and how a woman in a wheelchair who had asked too specifically about camera locations became, in the language of formal determinations, the source of a regrettable misunderstanding. She knew all of this. What they didn't know, what Marcus Briggs specifically didn't know when he said just a nurse to the terminal air, was that she'd spent 11 years operating in environments where the institutions were less stable, the stakes were considerably higher, and the opposition had considerably more resources and considerably less interest in procedural niceties. And she had come out of every single one of those environments with what she'd gone in to protect. Her record wasn't perfect. Nothing was. She'd made calls she still second-guessed, in moments she didn't revisit unless she had a specific reason to. She wasn't a hero. She was a person who had made a choice, repeatedly, in difficult circumstances, to use the skills she had for people who needed them. She was also a person who was currently standing at the top of her sister's stairs, exhausted and knee-sore and 400 miles from home, who had just found out that someone was trying to bury the evidence that she had been knocked from a wheelchair and left on the floor while 60 people watched, and said nothing. She was tired. She was also not going to let it go. She went downstairs and found Nora in the kitchen, not watching the television, just sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold, the way Nora sat when she was waiting for Emily to come tell her something. "What's happening?" Nora said. Emily sat down across from her. Her knee sent up its standard complaint, and she ignored it. She looked at her sister. The familiar face, the particular attention in Nora's eyes that had been there since they were kids, the way Nora had always watched her with the specific focus of someone who understood that Emily would tell you things sideways if you waited for her to tell them directly. "They're trying to change the story," Emily said. Nora wrapped both hands around her cold mug. "Of course they are. There's a journalist who has the real footage, and a military contact who's trying to get ahead of it on the federal side. And the airport is going to make a formal determination in the next day or two that may or may not reflect what actually happened." Nora looked at her steadily. "And what are you going to do?" Emily was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car passed. Down the street, a dog barked twice at something and stopped. "I'm going to make sure," she said, "that they find out exactly who they decided to underestimate." Nora's eyes didn't change, but something underneath them did. Some older thing. Something that had been watching Emily make this face since long before there was a word for what Emily was or what she was capable of. "Okay," Nora said. Emily nodded. She started to stand and her knee protested, and she sat back for half a second, jaw tight, and then she stood again, slower this time, and moved toward the hallway. Behind her, Nora said, "Emily." She stopped. "Be careful," Nora said. "Not of them. Of yourself." Emily didn't answer because they both already knew she'd heard it, and she went upstairs to the spare room and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. And when her phone buzzed with a text from Aaron Marsh at 11:58, she almost didn't look at it. Then she looked. Federal Aviation Security has been notified. They've requested the original footage be preserved and flagged the Ridgehaven Airport security chain of custody as a potential tampering investigation. Also, I pulled your service record and forwarded relevant commendations to the federal contact. For context, Emily, they don't know what they started. She read it twice. Then she put the phone down on the nightstand and lay back on the bed with her hands folded on her sternum, staring at the ceiling in the dark. Her knee hurt. Her palm stung. She was 400 miles from her apartment and about 36 hours from a fight she hadn't asked for and couldn't walk away from. The last thing she thought before sleep finally came was not about the footage or the federal inquiry or Aaron Marsh's carefully certain voice. It was Briggs's arm swinging back, the geometry of it, the complete, total absence of hesitation. He'd done it the way you did something you'd done before, something practiced, something that had never cost him anything. She thought, it's going to cost him now. And then she was asleep. And outside Nora's narrow house, the autumn night settled into its second half, and 400 miles away in Ridgehaven, in a file server in the airport's administrative wing, someone was reaching for a record they no longer controlled. The file server was already cold by the time the federal request landed. That was what Aaron Marsh told her at 6:43 the next morning, his voice carrying the specific flatness of someone delivering bad news they'd been sitting with for a few hours. The original 12-second clip from the Gate 17 camera had been flagged for routine archival compression, a technical process. The airport's IT administrator would later explain that was part of standard 14-day cycle management. Compression that, as a procedural side effect, degraded resolution by approximately 60%. They didn't delete it, Marsh said. They're too smart for that. They just made it worse. Emily was sitting at Nora's kitchen table with coffee she hadn't touched. Through the window, she could see the back garden, still gray in the early light. How much worse? Enough that the arm contact is ambiguous. You can see a collision, you can see you go down, but you can't read the angle clearly anymore. A defense attorney would have a reasonable argument that the contact was incidental. She turned the coffee mug in her hands. But Vivian Tran has the original. Yes, and that's the problem. How is that a problem? Because the Langford legal team knows she has it. They filed an injunction this morning, Ridgehaven County Court, 6 a.m., claiming the footage was improperly obtained from a restricted security system and constitutes confidential airport operational data. They're asking the court to prevent publication and compel her to surrender the copy. Emily was quiet for a moment. In the background of the call, she could hear something that might have been a cafeteria or a hallway. Marsh was somewhere institutional, already in his day. Can they do that? She asked. Their lawyers are arguing they can. Vivian's editor has a media attorney on it, but a temporary restraining order is on the table and the judge reviewing the filing is... A pause. The judge reviewing the filing has had 2 Langford Group properties permitted through his county district in the last 18 months. She set the mug down. Of course he has. I want to be clear that I'm not telling you this is over. I'm telling you what the next 12 hours look like. What do the next 12 hours look like? Messy, he said, and I need something from you. She'd expected this. You didn't get 6 calls from Aaron Marsh without eventually arriving at the thing he needed. What? Your service record has a classified tier. The commendations I forwarded to the federal contact were the unclassified layer. Awards, deployment summaries, the things that exist on paper without context. But there's a tier above that, Emily. Operational records. What you actually did, where, and how. The federal investigator reviewing the tampering complaint wants context for why a military colonel is personally involved in an airport altercation case. If I provide that context, it changes the weight of this. It changes what I agreed to, she said. I know. She'd spent 11 years in the position of having a record that existed in 2 layers. The public one, which was thin and procedural and said nothing interesting, and the real one, which was locked behind clearance levels and described the kind of work that didn't make it into press releases. She'd maintained that separation deliberately. It wasn't shame. It was the understanding that the real record was not hers to use as a personal asset. It belonged to something larger than any one incident in any one airport. How much context, she asked. Enough to establish that the person on the floor of that terminal is not someone whose account can be credibly dismissed as confused or exaggerated. That's not an amount, Aaron. No, he said, it's not. I'm asking you to trust my judgment on the scope. She looked out at the garden. A bird had appeared on the back fence, small, brown, entirely unbothered by the situation. It sat there for a moment and then left. Do it, she said. But I want to know what you pull before it goes anywhere. Agreed. She ended the call and finished the coffee, which had gone cold, and then she called Vivian Tran. The journalist was sharper than Emily had expected, which was its own adjustment. She'd been prepared for eager, had been prepared for the particular energy of someone who knew they had a story and wanted to get there fast. Vivian was neither. She was 38, had been covering Ridgehaven city politics and institutional accountability for 11 years, and she asked her questions in the order that mattered, not the order that made good television. I want to be direct about what I can and can't do right now, Emily said. Good, Vivian said. I prefer that. I can confirm the incident happened as the footage shows. I can confirm I was not responsible for the contact. I can confirm that I provided emergency medical assistance to the Langford family's son afterward, and that no one from the family acknowledged that in any way. Can I quote you on that? Not yet. Not until I know what the court is going to do with the injunction. A pause. That might be after my window closes. I know, I'm asking you to hold anyway. Why should I? Because if you publish now with what you have, their lawyers kill it on the injunction, and the story dies with a procedural ruling that looks like it validated their account. If you wait, there may be a federal component that changes what you're reporting entirely. Vivian was quiet. Emily could hear her thinking, the specific quality of silence that wasn't discomfort but assessment. How long? Vivian asked. I don't know, honestly. That's a bad answer. Yes. Another pause. I'll hold until tomorrow noon. After that, I have to make my own call. Bear. Emily ended the call and went upstairs to check on her knee, which had stiffened overnight into something requiring careful management. She wrapped it properly, took the anti-inflammatory she'd been skipping because she didn't like the way it flattened her thinking at the edges, and came back downstairs to find Nora standing in the kitchen doorway watching her with the expression she'd been wearing since last night. What can I do? Nora said. Nothing. That's not an answer. I know. Emily stopped at the bottom of the stairs. Actually, does your laptop have a stable connection? Mine's been patchy. Second shelf in the office. Password is Tomas's birthday backward. She worked from the office for 3 hours. She pulled every publicly accessible document she could find on Dalton Langford's business relationships with Ridgehaven County, cross-referenced the airport board membership against Langford Group's filed permits and contracts, and built a timeline of the overlapping interests that was neither surprising nor, in isolation, illegal. This was how it worked. Not bribes in envelopes, but relationships in rooms, shared attorneys, mutual investors, the slow accumulation of goodwill between institutions and the individuals who ran them. She also found the witness. It took her longer than it should have because she was working with limited access and a slow connection, but she found him. A man named Paul Kessler, 51, listed in the airport incident log as a passerby who had provided a voluntary statement. She cross-referenced the name against Ridgehaven business filings and found a Kessler Consulting LLC with a registered agent address 2 blocks from Langford Group's downtown office. She cross-referenced further and found that Kessler Consulting had received 2 contracts from Langford Group subsidiaries in the previous fiscal year, totaling roughly $400,000. She sat back in Nora's office chair and looked at what she'd assembled. It was circumstantial, all of it. A journalist could build something with it. A federal investigator could subpoena the details that would make it more than circumstantial. But on its own, in the next 12 hours, it was the architecture of something rather than the thing itself. She forwarded everything to Marsh and to Vivian Tran separately, with different cover notes. To Marsh, witness has documented financial relationship with Langford subsidiaries. Suggest your federal contact pursue the subpoena angle. To Vivian, background only, not for publication yet. Kessler, look at the contracts. The call she didn't expect came at 2 in the afternoon. It was from Garrett Langford. She almost didn't answer. She held the phone and watched his name on the screen. She'd added it to her contacts after the paramedic handoff, standard practice, in case follow-up was needed. And she thought about the various ways this call could go and answered anyway, because not answering was also a choice. Ms. Carter. His voice was different from what she remembered at the gate. He'd sounded controlled there, the practiced boredom of a wealthy 26-year-old managing a public space. Now he sounded like someone who had spent a night in a cardiac monitoring ward and had done some thinking. I got your number from the paramedic's handoff report. I hope that's okay. It's fine, she said. How are you feeling? Like someone stapled my chest shut from the inside. A pause. Cardiologist says the ablation is still intact. The episode was triggered by... They think it was triggered by stress and a missed dose, which is my fault. It's manageable, she said, with proper medication adherence. Yeah. Another pause, longer. I heard what's happening. With the footage and what my father's team is doing. He stopped. Started again. I'm not calling about that. I mean, I am, but I wanted to say that I saw what you did at the gate. Before I went down and while I was going down, I saw you come through the crowd. She waited. You didn't have to do that, he said, after what Marcus did. Patient needed help, she said. That's not conditional. He was quiet for long enough that she thought the connection might have dropped. Then, my father doesn't know I'm calling. I assumed. I'm not going to testify against him or anything like that. I want to be clear about that. He's my father. But I'm also not going to... He stopped again. She could hear him finding the edge of something he hadn't fully decided yet. I have my own account of what happened. I was there, and if someone asks me directly, I'm not going to lie. Emily sat with that. It was not a commitment. It was a door left slightly open, which was different from an open door, but was not nothing. I appreciate you calling, she said. Take your medication. A short sound that might have been a laugh. Yes, ma'am. She hung up and sat in the office for a while, holding the phone. Then Aaron Marsh called, and the door that Garrett had left slightly open became considerably less relevant. The federal investigator pulled the chain of custody log from the airport server, Marsh said without preamble. The compression cycle was manually initiated. Someone ran the compression command at 11:47 p.m., the night of the incident, overriding the scheduled cycle. It wasn't automatic. She understood immediately. They have a timestamp and a terminal ID. The command was run from a workstation in the administrative wing that's assigned to the Deputy Director of Terminal Operations. Arthur Greel, the man who'd called her with cordial aggression and the language of formal determinations. "That's obstruction," she said. "Federal aviation security records. Yes, it's a federal offense." His voice had the quality it got when things were moving in the direction he'd been pushing them. Not satisfaction, something more disciplined than that. "The investigator is executing a preservation order on all remaining footage and associated administrative logs. They're also looking at the Kessler connection you sent." How long before this becomes something Langford can't manage quietly? It already is. His attorneys requested a meeting with the federal investigator this morning. The investigator declined. A pause. "Emily, they're filing a formal complaint against you with the Ridgehaven Nursing Board." She'd been standing. She sat down. "What grounds?" "Practicing without proper authorization in a non-clinical setting." "They're arguing your intervention with Garrett constituted unauthorized medical practice because you identified yourself to the paramedics using hospital credentials you're technically on leave from." It was precise. That was what made it alarming. Not the accusation itself, which was legally thin, but the precision of it. Someone had looked at what she'd done at the gate and found the specific angle that could damage her professionally. A complaint to the nursing board, even a frivolous one, went on record. It triggered a review. It generated paperwork and letters and the specific bureaucratic friction that wore people down. "They're trying to make this expensive," she said. "Yes." "For me personally, not just legally." "Correct." She looked at the wall of Nora's office. A child's drawing was pinned there. Tomas's, from the look of it, a house with improbable proportions, and a sun that took up a third of the page. Everything oversized, everything exactly what it was. "Aaron," she said, "you said you were going to pull from the operational record. I have a call scheduled with the investigator at 4. Include the Karavi deployment." She kept her voice level. "The full medical log from that rotation." A silence. "Emily, I know what it is. Include it." The Karavi rotation was 14 months she didn't talk about in rooms where she didn't have to. A forward aid station operating under conditions that had been classified at the time and remained partially classified now. She'd treated 41 patients in that rotation under conditions that most clinical environments would have found incompatible with treatment. 38 had survived. The 3 who hadn't had arrived past any threshold where survival was possible, and she still carried them anyway. The way you carried the ones you couldn't save even when the math was on your side. She'd received a commendation from that deployment that was written in language so carefully neutral it communicated almost nothing to anyone who didn't know how to read it. She was about to let someone read it correctly. "Including Karavi changes the conversation," Marsh said quietly. "That's why I want it included." Another pause. "Okay." She ended the call and sat in the office in the afternoon light, with Tomas's drawing on the wall and the cold coffee she'd brought up with her, and the particular weight of a decision made and no longer reversible. She'd spent a long time keeping the 2 layers of herself separate, the nurse everyone saw and the record that existed in sealed files. It wasn't about hiding, it was about keeping something intact that belonged to a context larger than any single situation. But Dalton Langford's attorneys were filing nursing board complaints. Someone had manually degraded security footage at midnight. A paid witness had signed a statement and been well compensated for his account. They had decided she was someone who could be managed, contained, buried procedurally until she got tired and went away. She thought about the floor of the terminal, the cold tile against her cheek, the 60 people who'd watched and said nothing, Briggs moving the wheelchair aside like debris. She thought about what it felt like to know exactly who you were, exactly what you were capable of, and be treated as though you were the least consequential person in a room. She'd spent her career making herself useful in places no one wanted to think too carefully about. She'd done it without asking for acknowledgement, without requiring anyone to understand what she'd done or why. That had felt, for a long time, like the right approach, like the dignified approach. She wasn't sure it was the right one anymore. Her phone buzzed, a text from Vivian Tran. Federal injunction on the restraining order. Judge recused himself. Conflict of interest. The footage holds. I'm ready when you are. Emily looked at the message for a long moment. Then she typed, "Tomorrow morning. I'll talk on record." She set the phone down, and in the quiet of the office, she could hear Nora downstairs, the sound of the kitchen, The kids home from school and already loud about it. The ordinary noise of a life continuing its ordinary movement around the edges of something that was no longer ordinary at all. Her nursing board had just received a complaint about her. The federal investigator had her operational record in his hands. And somewhere in Ridgehaven, Dalton Langford's attorneys were about to find out that the record they'd never thought to look for described a woman who had treated casualties under active fire, who had been extracted twice from compromised positions and returned to duty both times, who had received a commendation that the people who wrote it still didn't have adequate language for. Emily picked up the phone again, and she called Aaron Marsh back, and she said, "Tell the investigator I'll make myself available in person. Ridgehaven, day after tomorrow." "You're coming back?" "Yes." "What about your sister?" She looked at Tomas's drawing on the wall, the house with impossible proportions, the oversized son. "She'll understand," Emily said. And then the second phones, the one she'd left on the desk, Nora's landline, which nobody used, rang once, sharp, and stopped. And her cell phone lit up with a number she recognized as the federal investigator's office. And when she answered, there was a pause on the line before the voice came through. And the voice wasn't the investigator. It was Arthur Greal. "Ms. Carter," he said. His voice was not cordial anymore. It had shed all of the professional smoothness, and what was underneath it was something thinner and more afraid. "I need to talk to you before this goes any further. There are things about what happened that you don't know. Things I was told that I need you to understand that I didn't initiate the compression. I was instructed to run it. I have the message chain. I have everything." His breathing was audible. "And I think you're the only person I can give it to who won't make it disappear." She told Greal to stop talking. Not unkindly, but with the specific authority of someone who understood that what he was about to say on an unrecorded line to a person with no legal standing in the investigation was potentially useless and possibly damaging to both of them. "Don't tell me anything else," she said. "Not on this line." "I don't know who else. I'm going to give you a number. You're going to call it right now, and you're going to say exactly what you just said to me, word for word, to the person who answers. His name is Aaron Marsh, and he has the federal investigator's contact. Do you understand?" A shaky exhale. "Yes." She gave him Marsh's number from memory and ended the call and sat absolutely still in the office for approximately 4 seconds. Then she called Marsh. "Greal is going to call you in the next 2 minutes," she said. "He says he has the message chain that ordered the compression. He says he was instructed to run it." Marsh's pause was shorter than she expected. "By whom?" "He didn't get that far. I cut him off." "Smart." She could hear him moving, a door, footsteps, the ambient change of someone stepping out of one room into another. If he has what he says he has, this becomes criminal obstruction at the administrative level. That's a different category from the assault. "I know." "Emily, if this is what it looks like, I know, Aaron." She hung up, and she sat in the office with Tomas's drawing and the cold coffee and the weight of a situation that had stopped being about a scraped palm and a wheelchair in an airport terminal approximately 48 hours ago, and was now something she needed to see through, not because she wanted to, but because the alternative was watching someone bury the truth and call it procedure. She went downstairs and found Nora in the kitchen and said, "I need to go back tomorrow." Nora looked at her for a long moment. "I figured," she said. "I'll drive you to the airport." She was in Ridgehaven by noon the next day. Marsh met her at the arrivals level in a vehicle she didn't recognize. Civilian, unmarked, a practical choice. And he looked exactly as he always had. Compact, deliberate, the face of a man who had spent so long managing complex situations that complexity had stopped registering as stress and started registering as conditions. "Greal called," he said, before she'd fully settled into the passenger seat. "And?" "He has a text chain. 17 messages between himself and a direct line registered to Langford Group's Chief of Security Operations. The chain starts 3 hours after the incident and runs until 1 a.m. The final message is a specific instruction to run the compression protocol on the Gate 17 and Gate 19 cameras for the relevant timestamp window. The message includes the exact file path. She looked at the road ahead. "That's not ambiguous." "No, it's about as unambiguous as it gets." He merged onto the highway toward the city. The federal investigator executed a subpoena this morning on Langford Group's internal communications. They have 48 hours to comply. They'll stall. They'll try. The investigator is prepared for that. A pause. There's also a development on the nursing board complaint. She'd been waiting for this. What kind of development? The complaint was filed by an attorney whose firm has represented Langford Group in 4 separate real estate matters over the past 7 years. The nursing board's ethics chair flagged it this morning as a potential bad faith filing and requested documentation of the basis. The attorney has not responded. She felt something loosen slightly in her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been holding tight. Not relief, exactly. More like confirmation, the sense of a thing you'd predicted coming true, which was satisfying in the specific humorless way of being right about something you'd have preferred to be wrong about. "What's the investigator's timeline?" she asked. "He wants you this afternoon, 2 o'clock. She looked at the clock on the dashboard. 90 minutes. "I need to stop somewhere first," she said. "Pharmacy." "Your knee?" "I've been managing it badly." She kept her voice matter-of-fact. The knee had been arguing with her since yesterday evening, a steady percussion of discomfort that had crossed from manageable into something that needed proper attention. She'd been taking the anti-inflammatory inconsistently, skipping doses when she needed clarity, pushing the joint past what the surgeon had signed off on. This was the part she was less good at, the looking after herself part. She knew it. She'd always known it. Marsh pulled off at a pharmacy exit without comment. She got what she needed and took it in the car with a bottle of water, and Marsh drove and didn't say anything about the knee or the inconsistent management of it, which was one of the things she appreciated about him. The federal investigator's name was Daniel Reyes. He was 44, with the compact energy of someone who moved through institutions the way water moved through stone. Not fast, but with a kind of patient inevitability. His office was a borrowed conference room in the federal building on Ridgehaven's west side, with a window that faced a parking structure and a table that had seen several decades of exactly these conversations. He shook her hand without ceremony and gestured to the chair across from him. "I've reviewed the Karavi deployment record," he said, before she'd finished sitting, "and the full commendation file." "Okay," she said. "I want to say, for the record, and I recognize this is perhaps beside the point of why you're here, that what's in those files is significant. It's context," she said. "That's why it's there." He looked at her with the particular attention of someone recalibrating, which she recognized and didn't respond to. She knew what the record looked like to someone reading it without the frame of having lived it. She'd seen that look before. "Right," he said. "Context." He opened a folder. "Let's talk about Arthur Greel." They talked for 2 hours. Reyes was thorough and asked good questions and didn't editorialize, which she respected. She walked him through the incident as she'd experienced it. Not interpretation, not implication, just sequence. And he cross-referenced against the camera log timestamp and the Greel message chain and the Kessler consulting contracts she'd found, and somewhere in the second hour, he started making the particular kind of notes that meant he was connecting things that had been separately documented and finding that they aligned. At the end of it, he closed the folder. "There are going to be some developments in the next 24 to 48 hours, he said. "I'm asking you to stay in Ridgehaven and remain available." "I'm on medical leave," she said. "I have nowhere I need to be." He almost smiled. "Good." She stood to leave and he said, "Ms. Carter." She stopped. The nursing board complaint was formally dismissed at 11 this morning. The ethics chair found no basis for review. A pause. "I thought you'd want to know." She nodded once. "Thank you." She walked out of the conference room and down the corridor and into the elevator. And when the doors closed, she let herself put one hand flat against the wall and breathe for a moment. Just a moment. The nursing board complaint had been the one that had gotten under her skin the most. The calculated targeting of the things she'd built on the civilian side of herself, the work she'd chosen and returned to and intended to keep. The suggestion that she'd behaved improperly in helping a patient, that the things she'd done without hesitation on that terminal floor was something to be investigated. She straightened. The elevator doors opened. She walked out. The first arrest happened at 8:47 the next morning. She found out through Marsh, who texted her at 9 with 2 words: Briggs, assault. Followed 20 minutes later by a call with more detail. Marcus Briggs had been taken into custody at his apartment on a warrant for felony assault. The original footage from Vivian Tran's copy, combined with Greel's message chain proving the degraded version was deliberately altered, had given the DA's office enough to move. The assault charge was supported by the original 12 seconds, which showed not incidental contact but intentional force, a sweep that had been reviewed by a biomechanics consultant the federal office had retained, who'd put the force at 42 pounds of lateral impact, sufficient to destabilize any seated individual, wheelchair or otherwise. Briggs had reportedly said nothing when they cuffed him. Just looked at the warrant with the expression of a man whose certainty that this moment would never arrive had simply refused to update until the medal was on his wrists. Emily was eating breakfast in a diner 2 blocks from the hotel she'd booked when she got the news. She put her phone face down and finished the eggs, which were slightly overcooked, and drank the coffee, which was not. Outside the diner window, Ridgehaven was doing its morning thing. Traffic, pedestrians, a delivery truck blocking half the intersection, a woman walking a dog that had stopped to investigate something in the gutter with complete scientific commitment. She thought about Briggs saying just a nurse. She thought about the particular confidence in it, the total absence of doubt. She paid the check and left. The injunction against Vivian Tran's story collapsed at 11 that morning when the judge who'd taken over after the recusal reviewed the legal basis and declined to extend the temporary restraining order. By noon, Vivian had published. The story ran with the original 12-second clip embedded at the top of the page. It ran with the Kessler contract documents Emily had forwarded. It ran with a statement from Colonel Aaron Marsh, confirming that he was personally involved in the matter in his professional capacity, which was precisely calibrated language that said nothing specific and implied a great deal. And it ran with a quote from Emily, the one she'd given on record, 2 sentences, which read, "What happened in that terminal was not an accident, and it was not ambiguous. I documented it because I've spent my career in environments where documentation is the difference between the truth and whatever story someone with more power decides to tell." By 2 in the afternoon, the story had been picked up by 3 regional outlets. By 4, it had been picked up nationally, which was the point at which Dalton Langford's legal team issued a statement calling the reporting misleading, the footage decontextualized, and the federal investigation an overreach driven by a personal agenda. Emily read the statement in her hotel room and set her phone down and did her knee exercises, which she'd been skipping, lying on the hotel floor with the consistency of someone who had decided to stop self-sabotaging the recovery. The exercises were boring and uncomfortable, and the knee needed them. That was enough reason. Marsh called at 6. The federal subpoena compliance deadline passed at 4, he said. Langford Group's attorneys requested an extension. The investigator denied it. His voice had the quality it got when things were moving too fast for even him to fully front-run. They're executing a search warrant on Langford Group's communications servers tomorrow morning. She'd been expecting something like this, and it still landed with weight. A search warrant on the communications infrastructure of a company that size was not a quiet thing. It would generate documentation, depositions, the kind of institutional disruption that corporate entities spent enormous resources trying to prevent, because the disruption itself was damaging regardless of what the search found. "Is this still just the tampering?" she said. "No." A pause. The Kessler angle opened something. When the investigator pulled his contract records, they found payments from a Langford subsidiary that are structured in a way that looks less like consulting fees and more like, he chose his word carefully, contingent arrangements based on outcomes. She understood. He's not just a witness with a conflict of interest. He appears to have been paid to be where he was. There's a question of whether anyone directed him to be at that specific terminal at that specific time, and if so, what that means for how the rest of the incident was managed. She sat on the edge of the hotel bed. The knee was actually slightly better from the exercises, which she noted with the specific surprise of someone who knew the right thing to do and still hadn't quite believed it would work. "Aaron," she said, "how big is this getting?" "Bigger than a wheelchair," he said, which was always going to be the case. People who do this don't do it once. The Kessler pattern. He stopped. I'll let the investigation speak for itself, but the investigator is not a man who follows a thread halfway. After she hung up, she sat with the information for a while. The things she'd documented in Nora's back garden, the message chain on Greel's phone, the contracts she'd found in public filings. None of it had seemed individually like the foundation of something this large. It had seemed like the specific tactics of a specific man protecting himself from a specific consequence, but that was how it usually looked from inside it: small, targeted, manageable. And then you pulled one thread and found it was connected to something that had been there long before the incident that surfaced it. She knew this. She'd seen it in other contexts, other institutions. The systems that hurt people individually were almost never personal. They were structural. They were the residue of a long pattern of impunity that had accumulated into the certainty that certain people simply didn't have to account for what they did. That certainty was the thing that broke people. And it was the thing that was now, piece by piece, being taken apart. The next morning, she woke at 4:30 as always, made coffee from the hotel machine, and watched the city come into its early light from the window. At 6:15, Marsh called, "Search warrant executed at 6 a.m., Langford Group complying under protest. Their attorneys are filing a motion to quash in Ridgehaven Federal Court at 9. She wrote back, "Let me know what comes out." At 8:30, Vivian Tran texted her, "Second story running at 10, the Kessler angle. Are you available for a brief quote?" She thought about it. Then, "Yes, call me at 9:45. She spent the time between those calls walking, slowly, carefully, using the knee properly, not pushing it. Ridgehaven, in the early morning, was a different city than the one she'd encountered at the airport. Quieter, human-sized, the kind of city that had been trying to become something larger for 30 years and hadn't quite managed it and had settled into the negotiation between ambition and reality. She didn't know this city well. She'd been stationed at Ridgehaven Medical for 2 years and had learned the routes between her apartment, the hospital, and the handful of places she went regularly. She hadn't learned it the way you learned a place by choosing it. She thought, walking, about what came after this. The case would move on its own timeline now. Federal investigations had rhythms that individuals didn't control and didn't fully observe. Her involvement would narrow. She'd give statements when asked, provide documentation when required, and then she'd be peripheral to something that had started in the terminal of her own airport and grown into something that described a system rather than an incident. And she'd go back to work. The medical leave was almost over. Her knee was improving. The unit had been managing without her, which was fine. They were good, her team, and her absence hadn't broken anything. But she was ready to be back. She was better in motion. She was better when someone needed something from her. She'd always been better that way. She was rounding the block back toward the hotel when her phone rang, and she answered it without looking at the screen. "Emily?" The voice was Garrett Langford, and it was different again from either version she'd heard before. Not the practiced boredom of the gate or the stripped-down quality of the cardiac ward. Something in between, and underneath it something that sounded like someone standing at the edge of a decision. "Garrett?" "They searched our offices," he said. "This morning. I watched them carry out servers. My father's assistant was sitting in the lobby and she was crying." A pause. "He's not here. My father, he flew to his property in Clearwater last night. The attorneys said it was previously scheduled travel." She didn't say anything to that. "I talked to an attorney," Garrett said. "My own attorney, not the firm's." Another pause, longer. "She told me that if I have information material to a federal investigation, voluntary disclosure is in my interest." She used the word significantly. "Garrett?" She kept her voice even. "I'm not in a position to give you legal advice." "I know, I'm not asking for advice." He stopped. "I'm telling you because, I don't know, I wanted someone to know who wasn't my father's lawyer." He sounded 26 in the way that 26 sometimes sounded. Certain enough to make a decision, unsure enough to need someone to hear it. "I saw Briggs push your chair. I was standing there. I saw it and I didn't say anything, and I've been—" He stopped again. "I'm going to tell them what I saw." "That's your decision to make," she said. "Yeah." A breath. "Yeah, it is." He ended the call. She stood on the sidewalk outside the hotel and processed what had just happened. Garrett Langford was going to cooperate with the federal investigation. That wasn't just a witness. It was the billionaire's son who had been present, who had watched Briggs's arm swing and the wheelchair go over and his father walk on, and who had said nothing for 4 days and was now saying something. Whatever the attorneys found on those servers, Garrett's account changed the shape of what was provable. She went inside and called Marsh. "I know," he said, before she'd finished explaining. His attorney already contacted the investigator's office. "He's coming in this afternoon." "Did you know he was going to do this?" "I suspected he was thinking about it." A pause. "His father should have—" When someone saves your child's life, the correct response is not to file a nursing board complaint against them. She almost said something to that. Stopped herself. Some things didn't need a response to be understood. The motion to quash the search warrant was denied at 2:17 in the afternoon by a federal judge who wrote in her ruling that the legal basis presented by Langford Group's attorneys was, and this was a direct quote, per Vivian Tran's second story, which ran at 4, insufficient to overcome the substantial documented evidence of potential obstruction presented in support of the warrant. Vivian's second story ran with the Kessler contract documents and a statement from a former Langford Group employee, unnamed, quoted as a source with direct knowledge, who described a pattern of using outside contractors for tasks that, as the source put it, needed deniability more than they needed documentation. The story ran online and was shared 17,000 times in the first 3 hours. Dalton Langford's statement from Clearwater, issued through his attorneys at 5, was longer than the first one and considerably less controlled. It accused the federal investigation of being politically motivated, characterized Vivian Tran's reporting as defamatory, and announced that Langford Group was retaining additional counsel. It did not mention Marcus Briggs. It did not mention Arthur Greel. It did not mention the nursing board complaint that had been dismissed without review. Emily read it once and didn't read it again. Marsh took her to dinner that evening at a restaurant near the federal building that had been there long enough to have developed opinions about what it was and wasn't going to change. They sat across from each other in a booth that had seen a few decades of exactly this kind of meal. Two people from a specific context sitting in a civilian room trying to eat food like people who weren't thinking about the things they were both thinking about. "How are you doing with all of this?" Marsh asked. She looked up from the menu. "Eating." "Emily." She put the menu down. "I'm fine. The knee is better. The nursing board complaint is gone. Briggs is in custody. The investigation is moving." She paused. "I'm fine." "You went public," he said. "That's a change from how you usually operate." She looked at the table. "They didn't give me a lot of alternatives." "That's not what I said." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, a couple was navigating the sidewalk with a stroller. The particular negotiation of two people moving a third person's transport through a world not designed for it. She watched them for a moment. "The other way felt like disappearing," she said. "I've disappeared enough. It used to feel like the right thing to do. Quiet, behind the record, let the work be the thing. And I still think there's something right about that." She turned back to Marsh. "But there's also something wrong about being on the floor of an airport terminal and having 60 people watch and say nothing because the math of who has power told them not to. That shouldn't be the math." Marsh looked at her. He had a good face for listening. Steady, not performing attention, but actually paying it. "No," he said. "It shouldn't." They ordered. They ate. They talked about other things, the way people who'd operated together talked when they were choosing to be in the civilian version of themselves. A little carefully, but genuinely. She asked about his family. He asked about her unit at the hospital. They didn't talk about the investigation for the rest of the meal, which was the right call. The call came at 10:43 that night. She was in the hotel room, knee elevated, finishing a report she'd been drafting for her nursing unit, protocols she'd been reviewing on leave that needed updating, the kind of work she did when she couldn't sleep and needed her mind occupied with something useful. The number on the screen was the federal investigator's office, which was unusual at 10:43 at night. She answered. It wasn't Reyes. It was someone who identified herself as Reyes's deputy, a woman named Ferrante, with the clipped efficiency of someone making multiple calls in sequence and not wasting time on any of them. "Ms. Carter, I'm calling to inform you that Dalton Langford voluntarily returned to Ridgehaven this evening. He presented himself at his attorney's office at 9 p.m. and indicated through counsel that he was prepared to cooperate with the investigation. She processed this. He came back voluntarily. Oh, that's correct. After filing a motion to quash this morning. Correct. There was something under the word voluntarily that she recognized. The specific texture of cooperation that happened when someone's attorneys had told them that the alternative was considerably worse. Langford hadn't come back because he decided to do the right thing. He'd come back because the search of his servers and his son's cooperation and the collapsed motion to quash had collectively made the calculation change. What does that mean for the timeline, Tate? She asked. It means the investigator will meet with him and his counsel tomorrow. Beyond that, I'm not in a position to say. A pause. But I wanted you to be aware. Thank you, she said. She put the phone down and sat in the hotel room with the knee elevated and the half-finished protocol report on the laptop and the particular quality of a very late night when everything had gone quiet enough to hear yourself think. She thought about Dalton Langford walking into his attorney's office at 9 p.m. She thought about what his face had looked like when his son was on the floor. The first real expression she'd seen from him. The one where all the altitude fell away and left just a person. She thought about what it cost him to be back in this city right now, under these circumstances, and she felt not satisfaction, not triumph, something more complicated, something that recognized that the collapse of a person who had used power carelessly was not a simple thing, even when it was the right thing, even when they'd earned it completely. She opened the protocol report and kept working. It was 11:15 when the final message of the night arrived. Not from Marsh, not from Ferrante, not from Vivian Tran, from Paul Kessler. She stared at his name on the screen. She'd never contacted him. She'd found his name in the filings and passed it to Marsh and to Vivian and had not reached out directly because there was nothing to be gained from it and significant things to be lost. The message was 4 sentences. I was told I just had to be there and give a statement if asked. They said it was a routine matter. I didn't know what the footage showed. I didn't know about his record. She read it 3 times. His record. She typed back slowly. Whose record? The response took 6 minutes. Briggs. I found out today. From the news. I didn't know he'd done this before. She went very still. She typed, done what before? Another pause. Longer. She was beginning to think he wasn't going to answer when the message came through, and when she read it, the temperature in the room seemed to change. Or maybe that was just the thing that happened when information landed and rearranged everything you thought you understood about the shape of the situation. The same thing. A different airport, 2 years ago. Langford paid to make it go away. She didn't sleep. She sat with the phone in her hands and the hotel room humming its quiet electrical hum, and she read Kessler's message 4 more times as if the 4th or 5th reading would change what it said. It didn't. The same thing. A different airport, 2 years ago. Langford paid to make it go away. She typed, who was the other person? A long pause. Long enough that she thought he might have made his decision and retreated back into whatever calculus of self-protection had kept him silent until tonight. Then, a woman. I don't know her name. I only heard about it after. One of Briggs's former security colleagues mentioned it once, said Dalton always cleaned up Marcus's messes. She forwarded the entire exchange to Marsh with a single line. There's a prior incident. Find it. Then she put the phone on the nightstand and lay back and stared at the ceiling and thought about what it meant that Marcus Briggs had done this before. That somewhere there was another person, a woman, anonymous, unnamed in a second-hand account, who had encountered the same arm, the same force, the same indifference, and whose experience had been purchased into silence before it could become a record. She thought about what that silence had cost. Not financially, the other kind. The kind that settled into a person and changed the shape of how they moved through the world. She thought about how close this had come to being the same story. If Priya Desmond hadn't logged the incident, if Vivian Tran's source hadn't copied the footage before the compression ran, if Garrett had stayed in the comfortable silence his family expected of him. She thought about the 60 people in that terminal who had watched and said nothing. She didn't sleep. But somewhere around 3 in the morning, she stopped staring at the ceiling and started making notes on her phone. Not about the case, Not about evidence or timelines, but about the protocol revision she'd been working on, the one for her unit. She wrote 2 paragraphs about documentation procedures for patient handoffs in non-clinical emergency settings, which was a thing she'd been meaning to address for 8 months, and the writing of it was so entirely practical and specific that her brain finally released something it had been clenching since Kessler's message arrived. She fell asleep at 4, with the phone still in her hand. Marsh called at 7. There was a prior incident, he said. Memphis Shelton International Airport, 26 months ago. Incident report filed by a woman named Dara Osai, 34 at the time, a physical therapist traveling for a conference. She was using a cane, post-surgical, left hip. Briggs made contact in a boarding area. She fell. The incident was logged. Emily sat up in bed. And then? The airport record shows a settlement offer made within 72 hours. Osei signed a non-disclosure agreement and received payment from a legal entity that is registered to a Langford Group subsidiary holding company in Delaware. The incident report was administratively closed. Briggs was never disciplined, never charged, never even formally interviewed. She looked at the wall. The unremarkable hotel wall. Does Reyes have this? I'm calling him after I hang up with you. Emily, this is pattern of conduct evidence. In the context of what they already have, this potentially elevates the obstruction charge and opens Langford personally to civil liability that goes beyond the airport incident. A pause. It also means Dara Osei may be contacted by the federal investigation. Her NDA doesn't apply to federal investigators. You can't contract someone out of their obligation to provide truthful testimony in a federal matter. His voice was steady and certain in the way it got when the law was doing what the law was supposed to do and he was watching it work. This is significant. I know, she said. Find out if she wants to know what's happening. I'll see what I can do. She got up, made the bad hotel coffee, and stood at the window watching Ridgehaven's morning traffic assemble itself below. She thought about Dara Osei, who had been made to sign a document in exchange for enough money to close the incident, which also meant enough money to make continuing seem more costly than stopping. She thought about how that worked, not as coercion in any dramatic sense, but as a quiet institutional calculation that turned a person's injury into a liability to be discharged and filed and forgotten. She thought about how the first story always shapes whether there's a second one. Dalton Langford met with the federal investigator at 9 a.m. She wasn't there. She didn't know exactly what was said, and wouldn't for some time because federal investigations moved on their own schedule and didn't provide real-time narration. But Marsh called her at noon with what he knew, which was that the meeting had lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes, that Langford's attorneys had spoken more than Langford, and that the investigator had presented documentation from the server search that his attorneys had apparently not anticipated. They found internal communications directing Greel, Marsh said, not from the chief of security operations, from Langford himself. A message from his personal device to his chief of operations forwarded to Greel with specific language about the footage that his attorneys are going to have a very difficult time characterizing as anything other than what it is. She set her coffee down. He directed it personally. It appears so. The chief of operations was apparently the intermediary, but the initiating message is traceable to Langford's device. A pause that had weight in it. He's exposed, Emily. The attorneys know it. The question now is how much he cooperates and what he tries to trade. What does he have to trade? That's what the next few days will tell us. He paused again. There's something else. The Kessler subpoena came back with additional records. He was present at Memphis Shelton 2 years ago as well. Different cover, listed as a business traveler, not connected to the incident in any documentation, but flight records and hotel receipts put him at the airport the day of the Osei incident. The shape of it settled into something clear and cold. Kessler was not just someone who'd been convenient. He was a component of a system, a person used repeatedly to provide a civilian presence, a neutral-seeming account, the scaffolding of credibility around whatever version of events needed to survive. He'd been deployed in Memphis, and he'd been deployed here. And both times Marcus Briggs had done something that required a witness to describe as something other than what it was. He knew, Emily said, when he signed that statement about me. He already knew what Briggs had done before. Yes. She was quiet for a long moment. She thought about Kessler's message the night before. I didn't know what the footage showed. I didn't know about his record. She turned it over. Maybe it was true, that narrow piece of it. Maybe he hadn't known about the footage. But he'd known about Briggs, and he'd signed the statement anyway, and those were two different things that he was going to have to carry. What happens to Kessler? She asked. He's cooperating. His attorney negotiated the terms this morning. He'll provide full testimony in exchange for consideration on any charges related to false statement. A pause. He's not a good person, but he's a useful one right now. I know, she said. That's how it usually works. The story about Dara Osei broke 3 days later. Vivian Tran had found her. Emily didn't know the details of how. Vivian was not someone who explained her methods, which Emily had come to understand was a form of professional integrity rather than evasion. What she knew was that Dara Osei, now 36, living in a different city, working at a rehabilitation clinic, had agreed to go on record. The story ran with her name, her account, and a photograph she'd chosen herself. A professional headshot, dignified and direct, the face of someone who had made a decision about being seen. Her account was not dramatic. That was the thing that made it land. She described the boarding area in plain language, the contact, the fall, the specific pain of a surgical hip hitting an airport floor. She described the settlement offer arriving faster than any institution had ever moved on her behalf. She described signing because the alternative was a process she couldn't afford in money or time, or the emotional cost of fighting something that the people around her kept suggesting she'd misread. She described what the NDA had required of her. Not just silence about the incident, but a specific clause prohibiting her from disclosing the existence of the settlement itself. And she described reading about Emily Carter in the news and recognizing, with a clarity that she said felt like something snapping back into place, that she had not misread anything. Emily read the story twice in the hotel room, and then she called Nora. I saw it, Nora said, before Emily had said anything past hello. Yeah. How are you? Emily thought about the question with the honesty it deserved. Tired, she said. Not in a bad way. In the way where something's been running for a long time and it's starting to slow down. Come back when it's done, Nora said. Lily asks about you every day. She's decided you live here now. Tell her I'm working on it. Are you actually? Emily looked at the window. The Ridgehaven skyline, which was modest and had its own particular character, the kind of city that didn't try to be something it wasn't. She'd been here 2 years and hadn't paid it enough attention. No, she said. But tell her anyway. The formal charges were announced on a Thursday morning, 11 days after the incident in the terminal. Marcus Briggs was charged with felony assault and battery and with obstruction of justice related to his communication with Greel through the Langford Group security chain. His attorney entered a not guilty plea at arraignment, and he was released on bail. That was, by the standards of such things, substantial, a number that reflected the seriousness of the federal component rather than just the state assault charge. Arthur Greel was charged with federal obstruction of justice for the manual compression of the security footage. He had cooperated extensively, and his attorney had negotiated hard, and the charge he faced was serious but singular. Paul Kessler was charged with making a false statement to airport security in connection with a federal investigation. He had also cooperated. His exposure was less than Greel's by an increment that his attorney had worked for. Dalton Langford was charged with obstruction of justice, directing destruction of evidence in a federal matter, and this was the piece that had emerged from the server search and the communication records in 3 days of the investigator working through what the documents contained. Conspiracy to cover up a prior incident of assault by an employee. The Memphis Shelton situation and the deliberate structuring of Dara Osei's settlement to prevent disclosure of a pattern had become its own count. His attorney issued a statement that was lengthy and careful and said, in essence, that Dalton Langford was a respected business leader who had been unfairly targeted and intended to defend himself fully. The Ridgehaven Courier ran the charges on the front page. So did the 3 national outlets that had picked up Vivian's original story. By noon on Thursday, the Langford Group Board had issued a statement of its own, noting that Dalton Langford had voluntarily stepped back from his operational role pending resolution of the legal matter. By 3 in the afternoon, Two of the county's contracted projects with Langford Group had been formally placed under review by the county executive's office. The billboard near the airport exit, Dalton Langford's face, the silver hair, the jaw that photographers had loved, was still there. Someone had put a piece of tape across one corner of it. Emily drove past it on the way to the federal building and registered it the same way she'd registered it the first time. Background: incidental. The city rearranging itself around something that was no longer the same. Reyes met with her for a final formal interview that afternoon. It was shorter than the first. The record was largely assembled, her account had been corroborated from multiple directions, and what remained was the kind of procedural completion that federal processes required. At the end of it, he said, "I want to tell you something, and I want to be clear that it's not something I say as part of this process." She waited. "What you did in that terminal, the documentation, the camera reference, the badge number, most people don't think that way in the moment they're lying on the floor. Most people are just trying to get up." He looked at her steadily. The habit of documentation saved this case. Everything else that happened, the footage, the Kessler connection, Greel's message chain, it was all pursuable because you'd established a contemporaneous record that couldn't be rewritten. She thought about that, about the years of operating in environments where documentation was the only protection you had against the alternative version of events, about the ways the habit had formed in her, not consciously, not as a strategy, but as the residue of understanding that the truth had to be written down to survive contact with people who wanted to rewrite it. "I didn't do it because I knew it would matter," she said. "I did it because it's what you do." He nodded. That's usually how the important things work. She left the federal building at 4:15 and stood on the sidewalk in the autumn light and breathed the Ridgehaven air, which smelled like exhaust, and somewhere a restaurant doing something involving garlic that she was going to have to find. Her knee was better. Not good. The surgeon had told her 8 weeks, and she'd been arguing with him about it since the beginning, and the argument was still ongoing, but better, functional, manageable. She called Marsh. "It's done," she said. "Not entirely," he said. "The legal process, I know, I mean my part. My part is done." A pause. "Yes, your part is done." He sounded, for the first time in all of this, like he was allowing himself something that approached relief. "Emily, for what it's worth, I've known a lot of people who would have let this go. Not out of weakness, just out of the practical calculation that it wasn't worth what it was going to cost." "I know," she said. "What made you not?" She looked down the street. The restaurant with the garlic was visible now. A small place, red awning, a handwritten specials board in the window, a line of 3 people waiting for a table outside, which in Ridgehaven in October meant the food was worth it. "Because the floor of that terminal was cold," she said, "and 60 people watched, and nobody said a word." She paused. "I've spent a career in places where the silence meant something different, where you stayed quiet because the noise would get people killed. This wasn't that. This was something else." Marsh was quiet. "If I'd let it go," she said, "Dara Osi would still be the only one who knew what she knew, and the next person Briggs did it to would be the third." She stopped. "I'm not built for letting things go when the cost of letting go falls on someone else." "No," Marsh said, "you never were." She said goodbye and walked toward the red awning because she hadn't eaten since breakfast, and the garlic smell was a direct instruction. Walk. The ceremony was held 3 weeks later on a Saturday morning when Ridgehaven had finally committed to autumn and the air was cold enough to see your breath. It was not a large ceremony. She'd been specific about that when the requests started coming, from the hospital administration, from a veterans organization whose regional director had read Vivian's stories, from a city council member who'd called Marsh's office to ask about appropriate recognition. She'd said, "Small, please." And they had mostly listened, which was better than she'd expected. The location was Carver Plaza, a small square 2 blocks from the federal building that had been named for a Ridgehaven physician who had established the city's first free clinic in 1943 and spent the following 40 years being intermittently difficult about it. She hadn't known that history until the ceremony's organizer mentioned it, and she'd thought, that's the right place. About 150 people came. Hospital staff, her unit, other floors, people she knew well, and people she recognized and a few she'd never met who had apparently decided they wanted to be there. Veterans from the regional post, some in uniform, some not. Priya Desmond from the airport, badge 441, who had logged the incident and flagged the camera record and apparently driven 40 minutes on a Saturday morning to be present. 2 paramedics. She recognized the one with the silver-streaked braid, who gave her a nod that she returned. Vivian Tran, standing slightly apart from the assembled crowd with the habitual observation position of someone whose job was to watch things. Garrett Langford was not there, which she hadn't expected and didn't hold against him. His world was complicated right now in ways that a public ceremony in Carver Plaza would not have helped. Nora was there standing near the back with Tomas and Lily. Lily was wearing a coat she was clearly refusing to keep zipped. Tomas had the expression of a child attempting to look appropriately serious at a thing he was also genuinely interested in. Marsh stood near the small platform in his dress uniform, which she'd told him was not necessary and he'd appeared not to hear. The city council member spoke briefly. The hospital's chief of staff spoke briefly. A veteran's representative spoke for slightly longer than briefly, which she endured with the patience of someone who had endured considerably longer speeches in considerably less comfortable conditions. And then Marsh spoke. He didn't use notes. He stood at the microphone and spoke the way he did everything, directly, without performance, saying the thing he meant in the order it needed to be said. Emily Carter served in military medical operations for 11 years, he said. I'm not going to tell you the details of that service, because some of it isn't mine to tell, and some of it would take longer than we have this morning. What I will tell you is that in environments where the variables were bad and the margins were narrow, she made decisions that most people in those rooms were not capable of making. And she did it not because she was fearless. She did it because she had a very clear sense of what her presence in that room was for. He paused. 3 weeks ago, she was on the floor of an airport terminal. She'd been knocked from her wheelchair by a man who didn't think the consequences applied to him. She documented what happened with a level of precision that later proved essential to a federal investigation. Then she got up and she helped the family of the man who'd knocked her down because a patient needed help, and that wasn't conditional. Another pause. She didn't tell anyone she was a decorated combat medic. She didn't ask anyone to reconsider their assessment of her. She just did what she was there to do. He looked at her. She looked back. The people who decided she was nobody, he said, were working with incomplete information. Someone in the crowd laughed, short, genuine, and the tension in the assembled group shifted into something warmer, and Marsh stepped back from the microphone. The commendation itself was a framed document and a medallion, both of which she accepted with the specific feeling of someone who found public recognition genuinely awkward, and had made peace with that awkwardness as the price of allowing people who cared to do something with the caring. They asked her to speak. She'd prepared something. 3 sentences, practical, thank the people who helped, acknowledge the city, done. She'd had it ready for a week. She stood at the microphone and looked at the 150 people in Carver Plaza in the autumn air, and she said the 3 sentences she'd prepared, and then she stopped and looked down at the commendation in her hands and said the thing she hadn't prepared. I want to say something about Dara Ose, she said. The crowd went quiet in a particular way. She's not here today. She lives in another city and she's working and she has her own life to get back to, which is exactly right. She looked up. But everything that came out of this, the charges, the investigation, the things that have been made public, a significant part of that came from her. From what she was willing to say, after being told that saying it wasn't an option she had. She signed a document that told her to be quiet, and she was quiet for 2 years. And then she read a news story, and she decided to stop. She paused. I want people to know her name. I want it to be part of the record of this. She stepped back from the microphone. The applause was not the explosive kind. It was the kind that builds from a few people and becomes something fuller and stays present longer than the showy kind. She stood in it and didn't try to diminish it with a gesture or a look away, which was its own form of allowing people to mean what they meant. Lily had gotten free of Nora and was navigating the crowd at hip height, with the serene confidence of a 4-year-old who had identified her destination and considered other people's legs a minor logistical issue. She arrived at Emily's side, looked up, and held both arms up in the universal communication of a small child who required immediate lifting. Emily bent down, bad knee and all, and picked her up, and Lily put both arms around her neck and said directly into her ear, "I'm cold." "I know," Emily said. "Your coat is unzipped." "I know," Lily said. Emily zipped the coat one-handed, which took 3 attempts, and Lily tolerated this with the patience of someone for whom warmth was an acceptable trade for the indignity of being managed. Then Nora appeared and took Lily back and gave Emily a look that contained a complete conversation they would have later, and Emily nodded once in acknowledgement. She talked to people after. The paramedic with the silver braid introduced herself as Kwan and said the handoff had been one of the cleaner ones she'd seen in a non-clinical emergency, which was high praise delivered in a language Emily spoke fluently. Priya Desmond shook her hand and didn't say much, just that she was glad it had gone the way it went, and that she'd never not log an incident again, which Emily understood to be something Priya was saying to herself as much as anyone. The veterans representative was a large man with a handshake that meant it, and a brevity she appreciated. Marsh found her near the edge of the plaza when the crowd had thinned. "Back to work Monday?" he asked. "Monday," she said, knees cleared. This was technically an optimistic interpretation of her last conversation with the surgeon, but the surgeon had also told her she was ahead of schedule, and she'd decided that was the operative data. Good. He looked at the plaza, the last few attendees dispersing, the folding chairs being stacked, the city resuming its Saturday operations around the edges of the thing that had just happened here. "You know this doesn't end cleanly. The trials will take time. Langford's attorneys are going to make it complicated." "I know." "Your name is going to stay in it for a while." "I know that too." He nodded. "Does that bother you?" She thought about it honestly. "Ask me in 6 months," she said. He almost smiled. "Fair." She said goodbye to Nora and the kids in the plaza, standing in the cold with Tomas explaining to her the specific ecosystem dynamics of a freshwater marsh, which his class had apparently moved on to after the wetland unit, and Lily silently pressing against her leg in the way that 4-year-olds expressed affection through proximity rather than language. She hugged them both. She told Nora she'd call when she got back to the apartment. "Drive carefully," Nora said. "I'm not driving. Knee." "You know what I mean." She did. She drove herself back to the apartment anyway, because the surgeon's clearance was close enough and she was tired of asking for rides, and she parked in the garage and took the elevator up and walked through the front door of her apartment, which smelled like the particular dusty neutral of a place that had been empty for 3 weeks. She put her bag down. She turned the heat up. She opened the window in the kitchen for a few minutes anyway because the apartment needed air, and she stood at the kitchen counter and looked at the stack of clinical journals she'd left there before the leave started, and the coffee maker that was going to need descaling, and the small collection of things that made up the ordinary surface of her life. She thought about what Marsh had said in his remarks. The people who decided she was nobody were working with incomplete information. She'd been glad he'd said it. It was accurate as far as it went, but she'd been turning over the piece of it he hadn't said, the piece she'd been sitting with since the floor of the terminal. The thing was that it shouldn't have required the complete information. The woman on the floor of that terminal, before the military record, before the commendations, before the classified deployments and the citations, and Marsh saying her name into a microphone with the weight of everything behind it, she deserved to get up without 60 people watching and calculating whether she was worth the complication of helping. That was not about what she had done or where she had served. It was about what she was. That was the part she couldn't resolve into something comfortable. That the truth had mattered in the end didn't change the fact that it had required this much of it to matter. That Dara Osei had needed Emily's incident to give her own account its weight. That a woman with a surgical hip and a cane had signed a document in an airport in Memphis and absorbed the cost of Marcus Briggs's certainty that cost didn't apply to him, because the institutions around her had looked at the math of who had power and done the calculation. She'd won this one. She knew that. The charges were filed, the record was corrected, the truth was on pages that couldn't be compressed back into ambiguity. Briggs was going to trial. Langford's name was attached to things that would outlast his attorney's best efforts to manage the narrative. Dara Osei's name was in the public record, which was what she'd asked for. But winning wasn't the same as the system being what it should be. It just meant the system had been made, in this case, in these circumstances, with these specific documents and this specific sequence of people making specific choices to do what it was supposed to do. That wasn't the same as it doing it reliably. That wasn't the same as the next person on the floor of the next terminal having the same chain of documentation and the same colonel and the same journalist with a source inside the airport. She thought about the 60 people who had watched. She thought about what it would have taken for one of them to move. She'd never know their names. She'd never know what the calculation had felt like from inside it. The math of stepping toward a stranger on the floor when the man who'd put her there worked for someone large and certain. She didn't think most of them were bad people. She thought most of them were ordinary people doing the ordinary human thing of looking at a situation and reading the room and deciding that the room had a logic they shouldn't disturb. She understood that. She'd spent her career in environments that required you to override exactly that instinct, where training and discipline replaced the ordinary human calculation because the ordinary human calculation was insufficient. She'd paid a price for that over the years, in the ways that people who operated in those environments paid prices that didn't always have visible line items. She didn't wish that on anyone, but she wished. She was standing in her kitchen wishing it, which was maybe as close to something like yearning as she got, that it were cheaper, that moving toward someone on the floor cost less, that the room's logic were different. She couldn't change the room's logic, not from where she stood, not by herself, not in any direct way. What she could do was the thing she'd been doing: be present, be skilled, be documented, refuse to quietly become what the calculus of power suggested she should be. Go back to work on Monday and treat patients with the same attention she'd given Garrett Langford on the terminal floor, because the quality of the attention didn't change based on who was watching or whether anyone was going to acknowledge it. She could do that. She'd been doing that. She was going to keep doing that. She closed the kitchen window and started the coffee maker and looked at the clinical journals on the counter. She picked up the top one. It was 2 months old, a nursing clinical review she'd been meaning to get to since before the leave, and carried it to the table and sat down and opened it. Outside, Ridgehaven was going about its business. Traffic on the avenue below. Someone in the building playing music she couldn't quite identify. The particular noise of a city that didn't know or care that anything had shifted, because cities rarely did. They just kept moving, absorbing what happened inside them, and continuing in the direction they were already going. She'd been knocked from a wheelchair on the floor of that city's airport, and she'd gotten back up, and she was sitting in her apartment now reading a clinical journal, and in 3 days she was going to walk back onto a hospital floor and put on her scrubs and check on her patients and argue with the night shift about protocol documentation and do it all again. The charges were filed. The record was corrected. The people who needed to be held accountable were being held accountable, imperfectly, through a system that was flawed in the ways that human systems were flawed, which meant it had taken more than it should have and produced something that was justice adjacent rather than the clean thing the word implied. That would have to be enough. It was enough. She'd learned across a career spent in the margins of the things that mattered, the places that didn't make it into the press releases, the deployments described in language so deliberately neutral it communicated almost nothing to anyone who didn't know how to read it, that the value of what you did was not in whether anyone acknowledged it. It was in whether it needed to be done, and you did it. She had done it. She turned a page. The coffee finished brewing. She got up and poured a cup and came back to the table and kept reading. Her name was in federal documents and national news stories, and a commendation she'd accepted in a plaza named for a physician who had been intermittently difficult about the right things for 40 years. Her knee was almost healed. Her unit needed her back. Dara Ose was in another city working in a rehabilitation clinic, and her name was in the record now, which was not everything but was not nothing. The woman they had stepped over on the way to the gate was still here. That was the whole thing, in the end. That was what they hadn't calculated for. Not the record, not the military commendations, not Aaron Marsh and the federal investigator, and the 12 seconds of footage that couldn't be compressed back into ambiguity. Just that she was still here and still working, and had never once in the entire duration of this required anyone to understand who she was before she decided to be useful. She hadn't done it because she was brave. She'd done it because it was what you did. And she was going to keep doing it, on the hospital floor, and in the corridors and in every room she entered for the rest of the career she'd chosen and rebuilt, and was going back to on Monday morning. Some rooms underestimated her. She had learned a long time ago to let them. The adjustment always came eventually.